Hello everybody. Have anybody heard me speak before? Who's heard me speak before? Put your hand up. Well, I'm amazed you've come back. There's a lot of us today. I don't normally speak to so many people. I once got in trouble by saying I've never seen such a dense crowd. But I'm talking about that. I'll start with a quote from my friend Richard Dawkins. The programme was recorded for Channel 4 to celebrate 200 years of Charles Darwin's birth. In, I think, 2008 we recorded the talk, and it's heavily edited by Channel 4. And I was still working in those days. I just turned 70 years old, so I'm on borrowed time. And I was still head of chemistry at Bluecoat School in Liverpool in those days. Some of my slides, by the way, just to say a couple of things before we actually start. Some of my slides are dense with words. Don't try and copy them all down. At the end, if you give me your email address, I will email you the whole presentation if you want to. Okay, if you'd like that. And then you can go through it. I haven't got time. I'm told I've only got 40 minutes to speak. So, So here's a quote from Richard Dawkins. There are some words to describe me. One of them will come up in a minute. As you can see what Dawkins thinks. Ignorant, insane, stupid, or even wicked. Hope that's not true. Nick Cowan is a scandal. Time him teaching. This was said again in 2008. I'll start the article. It was called I Call It Brainwashing. Well, so do I, Richard, when you say that you've got to teach evolution in the science classroom, but you can't teach creation. In my view, neither of them is a science. They're both worldviews from which you filter evidence. This is the article. I call it brainwashing. And I'm going to mention in there, it got me in a bit of trouble at school, but I was nearly retired by then, so I got away with it. Who's ever been called a bigot for what they believe? Yeah, I've been called a bigot loads of times. Well, I am a bigot. I'll admit it. Because I'm big. Next time somebody calls you a bigot for what you believe about the Bible, then use that one. You won't know of Marcus Ebelin unless you've read that book. It's about intelligent design, gives a good argument. But basically, evolution hopes that you don't know chemistry, and what Ebelin says is biblical creation or intelligent design hopes you do know chemistry. And I believe that it's chemistry that deals the death knell, I believe, to molecules to man evolution. I'll show you some of the ways that evolutionists try and get around this as we go through the talk. That's what people believe. Andy showed a very similar slide in his talk. Basically, Big Bang, 13.8 billion years, etc. Sun and stars form, and all of a sudden, poof, life comes into being. As a teacher, I get syllabuses and schemes of work sent, and I remember GCSE chemistry last time I taught GCSE was pre-2006, but I remember the scheme of work said something like this. About 3 million years ago, plants appeared. And these are not scientific statements. These are statements of faith. What I will try and show you today is that evolutionism is not science, it's a worldview through which evidence is filtered. Steve Taylor you're going to miss seeing, unless Steve, who's had to go to hospital for a checkup, appears tomorrow. You may not see him, but he will... I don't know what I was going to say then, but never mind, let's move on. So, life. What is a living organism? And the definition of life, according to NASA, they're not biologists obviously, but they define life as this: a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Can you see what they've done there? They've made evolution part of their definition of life. Yeah? So life includes, so if you are a living person, living organism, then you're going to believe in Darwinism, and it presupposes it as a fact of life. what I propose to show is that evolutionism, well, chemistry deals it to death now. An unverifiable belief system, the religion of the atheist, and then should it be that of the Christian? And you'll all know, I was interested in Jess's talk, whether you encountered in Namibia any theistic evolutionists. You say lots of Christians there. And I think I know, was it Grace Church Carlisle? I think there's some good folk in that church, some wonderful folk, who are creationist. Yeah, well, should Christians embrace evolution just because they're taught so in the classroom? And, you know, I love David Attenborough's nature films, but I switch the sound off because you get an overlay. I mean, it's great to see what God has done. It's not great to hear what David Attenborough thinks when he trots out his millions of years. And Brian Cox, every time he says billions of years, he emphasises the billions so extremely that I think he's overstating his case. So, one of the fatal blows to evolutionism is the idea that you can go from non-living matter to life. And I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at that and looking at some of the chemistry. At the end, by the way, I've got a few handouts on the table. I've only got about 20 of them. But again, if you wanted them, I can get them to you if you let me know how to do it. So origin of life, OOL. So mutation plus natural selection. You can only get evolution when you've got living organisms. You don't get natural selection when you've got something to select. If there's no life, then you can't have evolution. So existing living organisms are necessary. But how did the first self-sustaining chemical system arise? How did you get your first cell? And science has no answer. Let's go back to Richard Dawkins. No, let's not actually. Let's hang on. I just need to go back there. I'll just skip forward to. Why is it not going back? Oh, never mind. We missed one. Let me tell you what was on the slide we missed.
You've got that.
Oh, it was just Darwin's tree.
You've got to get rid of this.
Oh, right. Okay.
You're going to have problems with that, if that's the case. Right.
It's gone.
Yeah. Okay, now you can go back.
Yeah, but
you should be able to go back.
Are you sure? Oh, yes. It's all right. That's okay. Right. We cracked it.
Sorry.
Darwin's tree, okay, that's a creation of Charles Darwin. It's not a diagram that's very colourful and pretty, but it makes no explanation of how the proto-cell. Darwin just assumed life came from a common ancestor right back to a single cell, but how did the single cell arise? That's what chemistry, I believe, will deny. Instantly, Darwin was manipulated by his atheist friends, people like Huxley. The first edition of Origin of Species made reference to the creator. And Darwin wasn't, well, he certainly wasn't a believer in the sense that we would say, as someone who was born again of God's Spirit who trusted in Christ. Nevertheless, he grew up in a religious environment, and I believe he put that in. But he was under pressure from atheists to deny this. And this was what happened through the 19th century, is that Christianity fell out of favour because of the endarkenment, as Andy defined this morning. I think he's absolutely right. And you'll have heard of the primordial soup, the warm pond, and the lightning, a bit like Frankenstein's monster, isn't it? So when did life begin? Well, what you see in chemistry and biochemistry textbooks is not science. These are not scientific statements. Jack Szostak, by the way, is a Nobel laureate, and he said the first life evolved from non-living matter around 3.7 billion years ago. No evidence for that at all, just stated as a fact. Livingstone, I presume, the Emeritus Professor in Inorganic Chemistry, yeah. Around 3.83850 million years ago, the first life forms appeared in the oceans. So just appeared. No mechanism, no proof. And of course, we can't go back in time. This is why evolution is not a science. The battle is not between science and religion. It's between a worldview called evolutionism and a worldview based on the Bible called creationism. We're not on a level playing field when schools say, oh, evolution, that's part of your A-level biology, that's science. But creation, that belongs in the general studies class, belongs outside in the ethics class or whatever. And then a classic text, McKee and McKee, is a standard work. It's been around for a number of years. If you're doing, anybody doing biochemistry at university? Nobody. Oh, you are? Brill. Do you know that textbook? No, okay. There may be, biochemistry moves very quickly. If that's 2003, it's probably all out of date by now. That was my subsidiary at university. I did chemistry as Americans say, the major, and then I did some biochemistry. So there we are. The Earth was formed from a cloud of condensing cosmic dust and gas 4.5 billion years ago. Life arose thereafter. See, these are not statements of science, are they? Science has to be observable, repeatable, measurable. It should make predictions. How can you make predictions if your theory is based on random mutations? You can't predict when they're going to occur. It has to be falsifiable. That means capable of being disproved. But this is what I was going to say about Steve Taylor. Who talks a lot about soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. When the lady, Professor, you may have heard of Mary Schweitzer in America, University of Wisconsin, found the famous T-Rex bone with, when they cut it in half, stretchy tissue, blood cells, she didn't say this is obviously young. She said, we know it's at least 65 million years old. So there must be a new mechanism of preserving the tissue. Do you see? She wouldn't lay down her preconception that it was 65 million years ago because dinosaurs lived 65 million years ago and died out, didn't they? Well, answer, no. And they're mentioned in the Bible. And Andy was talking about the behemoth during the break. And there's a paper coming out soon on this from Steve Taylor and, and Paul Lawrence. So, no evidence at all. Right, now, anybody know Liverpool well? Know the railway line? Okay, yes, of course you do, Paul. You came with me in the car, right? Okay, this is a station on the Liverpool Metro, and it was built. I don't know if you can see that date there. It was built in 1990. It's a new station called Brunswick. Okay, now how long do stalactites and stalagmites take to form? Oh, thousands of years. Well, now I hope I don't get shot down over this. It's happened again. What have I done? Sorry.
Let me help you.
Just let me go back.
Get rid of that.
Yes, and then go back.
Go back.
Oh, right. Okay, there we are. Right. Now, I'm wary of saying what I'm going to say now because Paul might shoot me down because he's a proper geologist, not a pretend one like most chemists. But these are growing under the platform. Now, they're calcium carbonate. That's right, isn't it? And that's the chemistry bit. And I know they're not in a cave. So people say they're not stalactites, they're not in a cave, but the station's only been there just over 20 years. And that's how long they are already. When I took this photograph, I had to sort of climb down and get under the track and lean over. And the people on the other side of the station, they're on the side away from the booking hall, were shouting across, "Goy, what are you doing there?" I sort of disappear quickly. Yeah. There's a lot of evidence for young Earth. There's the soft tissue, chemicals like collagen. Collagen doesn't last. Collagen is one of the tissues that we're made of. It can't be 65 million years ago. They would have degraded. They would have broken down. You don't get those chemicals today that are that old. Carbon dating. Some of the, again, Steve Taylor is the better man to talk to you about this, but some of the dating done by the University of Georgia, I think, it was Georgia State University in the States. They were doing looking at dinosaur bones, and they were getting dates of 2,000, as little as 2,000 years old. You know, I mean, I won't go into, this isn't a talk on dinosaurs and things, but yeah, they're not as old as you think. And they're mentioned, I believe, in the Bible. I don't believe 30,000 either, but there we go. Carbon-14 in coal and in diamond. People say, oh, well, it's contaminated by modern carbon, which, of course, has that very small percentage, about 1 in 10 to the 12 atoms of carbon is carbon-14, which is radioactive. When something dies, well, when it's alive, it's exchanging carbon with the environment. When you were eating your lunch, the burger eventually came from the cow, probably. And the cow got it from the grass, and the grass got it from photosynthesis, and it's being made in the upper atmosphere by cosmic radiation on the nitrogen. Everything living has the same small percentage of carbon-14. And one of those sheets over there is about... no, it isn't actually, never mind. Carbon-14, you wouldn't get contamination of carbon in diamonds. If you know anything about the crystal structure of diamond, apart from being isotropic and same in all directions, it's very, very stable. The hardest natural substance known, diamond. So how you can contaminate, how you can get a rogue carbon-14 in there, it's virtually impossible, I would suggest. You can make oil and fossils in days, not millions of years. They reckon 11 days to make oil. You can actually create, there'd be synthetic fossils. Obviously they're not real. Maybe they make them in China and sell them to the West at ridiculous amounts. Mounts and Helens has not been mentioned. I mean, Paul obviously is the expert on this. But Mounts and Helens erupted basically in Washington State, USA, about just over 40 years ago. And features like canyons were there in days and even weeks. You say, this can't happen. I don't know how the American geologists wash it under brush it under the carpet. It's unbelievable, because they can see these features that are supposed to be uniformitarian, very old, happening by catastrophe very, very quickly. And then helium sent in the atmosphere is far too low. Again, they say, oh, well, helium's leaking out into outer space. Well, why not other gases? Hydrogen, for example, is molecular mass 2, helium is atomic mass 4. I don't see why the helium should leak out and not anything else, but there we go. Okay, let's do a bit of biology. You're supposed to cheer then if you're a biologist. Biogenesis. We've had the word abiogenesis, which means not. If you put a in front of something, I'm a theist. I'm not a theistic evolutionist. I'm a creationist, but I'm a theist because I believe in a personal God, a God we can know, a God who reveals himself. I'm not a deist. Somebody believes in the God who winds up the universe like clockwork and then takes a back seat, the God of Descartes, for example. Life begets life. You only get life from living matter. Okay? There's an old theory called spontaneous generation. We'll look at that in a second and see how Louis Pasteur, who was basically contemporary with Charles Darwin, basically debunked the whole spontaneous generation theory. And the second law is that living organisms breed after their own kind. Now, you can get mutations. And it was a monk called Gregor Mendel. He was living in a monastery in Austria, but he was also extremely bright and gave talks to the local, creation group, the equivalent of the Royal Society in Vienna or whatever. The principles of heredity, that means inheritance of characteristics. He did it by observing the pea plants in the monastery garden. Very clever man. And around about 1866, I think he published his, just after Darwin, he published his discovery that all you can do with genetics is basically shuffle what you've already got. Yeah? I mean, if you do biology, you'll know this. You have male and female gametes with half the number of chromosomes, 23 in each, and then they fuse. And so you have some characteristics of each of your parents. And that's how genetics works. You can't get new genetic information. Where does it come from? Oh, well, it comes, the evolutionist says, by, random mutations and chance. I don't buy that. I just think that's absurd. Information, and again, Andy has spoken very well on this in the past, is something you just can't get by destructive things like radiation and chemicals, which may produce mutation. But the mutations are almost always damaging. And you can't create whole organs of the body that there is no information for by those sort of processes. That's a biological rather than a chemical position. There's no way of adding information to the gene pool. You need a designer. This is Richard Dawkins coming up. How did life begin? Basically, nobody knows. Professor Stuart Kaufman is Calgary University, Canada, and and then we start. Yes, I'm going to do this in stages. Dawkins was asked by Ben Steen on. Have anybody got this, by the way? Let me show you some. Who knows this DVD? Yeah, it's good. Recommended. It's called Expel. It's not necessarily creationist. It's more intelligent design. A chap called Ben Steen, American interviewer, interviews Richard Dawkins, and he's basically asking him, how did life begin? The title, by the way, is to do with American academics who've been fired from their jobs in universities, from their positions, holding chairs, doctorates, research students. If you come out as a creationist, you don't get your tenure renewed. You get the sack. Because there is a conspiracy to stifle creation teaching, and there is in this school classroom as well. So all this interchange is from that talk. So Steen in white, Dawkins in yellow. How did life get created? Dawkins, very slowly. Well, how did it start? Dawkins, nobody knows how it got started. We know the sort of event that must have happened at the origin of life. And what was that? It was the origin of a self-replicating molecule. Right, and when did that happen? We don't know. At least he's honest. But if you can't get life without the input of a designer, then isn't naturalistic evolution dead in the water? From New Scientist, it's an old article. Huge gaps remain in our knowledge of how life began. By the way, 2009, scientists are no nearer finding an explanation. The first genetic material might have been RNA. Very doubtful, actually, because RNA is chemically less stable than DNA. The double helix actually stabilises the structure. Life, RNA World, which I think is mentioned in one of those books you've been selling in the resources area. You can't do anything with RNA. That was a theory at one time. Some other unknown molecule. Again, we don't know. We don't know, but we still believe evolution. And you can't teach creation because that brings God in. It may have happened in a deep sea vent. Now, some chemistry coming up. Brian Cox, who lectures to the first year physics students at Manchester University, he's good television, isn't he? He's a good looking guy, he's cute, he's cool, he played in a rock band, and he's good down to earth northern accent. He dabbles in biology at his peril. He's basically an astrophysicist. I'm not saying he's not a good astrophysicist, but when he dabbles in biology, he goes off basically. He talks about life in a hydrothermal vent. That is, if you like, think of a volcano with lava, think of a vent producing hot gas from the Earth's mantle and core, coming up in the ocean and creating temperatures, superheated steam, I don't know, 200 Celsius maybe, And he says that's where life started. Others say it was crystals to do with clay rocks. I'm thinking, how does that work? They don't work. We'll come to that later. But basically, we just don't know. Another quote from Expelled. Ben Steen, when do you think what's about intelligent design might turn out to be the answer? Well, it could have come from somewhere else in the universe. Life on Earth, we see it can't evolve on Earth, but maybe it came from outer space. Well, doesn't that just project the problem one step back? Where did that come from? Oh, well, some other part of the universe, some other part of the universe. I mean, it's nonsense. They can't get to grips with it. These are faith statements. And, of course, the most egregious example of this is a chap called Francis Crick. And you'll know Francis Crick, one of the two Nobel laureates for the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA. Should have been 2 more Nobel Prizes, one to a woman, but they didn't give Ross Franklin and Wilkins a Nobel Prize. They did all the work. He believed life came from outer space. It's called the theory of Panspermia. So life on Earth came from outer space. And what's more, he believed it came on a rocket of an alien. I kid you not. And Watson, by the way, was an atheist. Crick. I mean, that's just a crazy statement, isn't it? From somebody, again, lauded in science terms as being, in science circles as being, a great hero in science. Discoverer of the double helix structure. That's just a crazy statement. Sorry, Andy, have I got your permission to use this?
Well, you have it. Seems you're a good friend.
A debate between Andy and an atheist called, is it Dan Barker? I can't remember. Dan Barker. And Andy jumped on him when a student's question came, how did the first molecules in the universe come to be if there's no God? We're going to look, by the way, at the elements. This is, if you've heard this talk before, similar. There's some new stuff at the end about the idea of stars being the source of the elements. Okay, so Dan Barker, we have a scientific model explaining how atoms can be created in stars in the cooling after the Big Bang. Again, assumption of the Big Bang, no evidence. And then Andy jumped on him. This is the crucial point. Nobody has ever observed a star forming or created life from non-life. If somebody was to do so, it would destroy the Christian position. Strong words. I wouldn't be a Christian. Well, it would shake me to the core. If evolution turned out to be true, I'd be totally shaken. But I'm convinced that the Bible teaches, and the Bible is reliable, that life came from, basically, and God said. So chemical evolution is still the weakest link. Well, we know this. OL researchers describe their recent scientific ideas. Well, again, basically this is, can't even pronounce the guy's name, a team of researchers in San Diego, and they're taking the 4 key biochemicals, if you like, that is proteins, nucleic acids, DNA, lipids, and where's the other one? Yeah, nucleus, peptides and lipids, right, okay. And basically he talks about prebiotic molecules coming together and being transformed, and then he says this. Poof. Reminds me of the fairy godmother in Cinderella. Poof. And suddenly everything's there. That's not science, folks. These are researchers, big names in their field. PhDs, doctor chairs in universities. And if you go onto Google and do a search in on origin of life, 78,000 articles, including sources from the Royal Society we've heard of today. It's just a faith position. Life can come from non-living matter. Nobody's ever discovered it. It wasn't...
Need to close.
I do. Right. It was first debunked, spontaneous generation. They used to think that rotting meat bred maggots. A pile of rubbish spontaneously formed rats. Of course, this is not scientific. Redl did a famous experiment. You'll see there with the flies. He noticed they laid eggs on the meat and on the top of that middle test tube with or whatever it is, vessel with cloth on the top. They could smell the meat, so they laid eggs on it. But no maggots on the meat that was totally covered. And that was 200 years before the next experiment. This was Pasteur's experiment. I'll skip it. It's the same year as Origin of Species. And then it was revived by the communists. Communism is basically atheistic. So there's a chap called Oparin in Russia who wrote a book, The Origins of Life, tried to take the Marxist position, and supported by a guy called Haldane, JBS Haldane, who was a good biologist. But do you know, he had a position at Churchill College, Cambridge, and he quit. Churchill was a new college built around the time between the wars, and he quit because they built a chapel. He was a God hater, a militant atheist. Sorry? Nigel?
I just said that's better than that.
You're right, okay. Which doesn't surprise me, we're about the same age. Basically, he revived the theory, the primordial soup. Yeah? It just doesn't work. The most famous example, the Miller-Urey experiment, 1953. Stanley Miller was a younger researcher. Harold Urey was already a Nobel laureate. And they designed a very clever experiment. Water vapour, methane, ammonia and hydrogen. 60 kilovolt electrical discharge, sparks through the soup of chemicals. And they got they got a cell. Of course they didn't. They got two in any quantity, two of the two simplest of the 22 now, amino acids that make up all our proteins. And like I said, a carefully designed experiment to prove there is no designer. There is no God. So they design the experiment. They interfere in the experiment. You know, they say, well, the hand of God didn't do this. No, the hand of Miller and Urey did this. They had an extraction method for pulling out the chemicals before they degraded and were chewed up by something else. They didn't have any oxygen around. And one of my sheets there, if you want to take one, I've got about 20 copies of it, has got a critique of that. This was one of the textbooks we used at the time, AQA science textbook. And within a few years of putting on the syllabus, it's only on for about 2 years, and there is a question on the first year of it, 2013, I think, GCSE chemistry paper. It's not science. It's complete faith. Of course, they loved it in the media, you know, life in a test tube and all that. And I mean, well, there's what's wrong with it. There's no oxygen in the early atmosphere. Well, oxygen, of course, would oxidise a lot of the stuff that's forming. But no oxygen, well, all those oxide rocks in the world, like CaCO3 and Al2O3, come on. And no O2 means no O3, which is ozone. That means ultraviolet radiation. Destroy the chemicals. There's never going to be enough concentration of them, and they only found glycine and alanine. And in those in tiny proportions, and they would have degraded. And Le Chatelier's principle, does that bring back some happy memories for those who did A-level chemistry? Chemical reactions oppose change. If you're trying to make an amino acid number 1 and 2 come together to get a dipeptide and water, what do you not want around? Water. And you don't want heat around either, because the reaction is exothermic. You want cool, not heat. Reactions oppose change. So the deep sea vent, 200 Celsius and loads of water in an ocean? Come on, Brian Cox, you can do better than that. It's nonsense. Chirality, left and right-handed. I've brought some gloves along to show you, but they haven't fallen down the back of the radiator. If you don't understand left and right-handed molecules, just think of a pair of gloves. Get them to stand up. You cannot superimpose them so that all the fingers match. All you can do is to show their mirror images. So just take a pair of gloves at home and do this. I'm fiddling around with this. It's a complete waste of time. Right, let me put those down. I learned a lot from watching Tommy Cooper when I was younger. Right, okay. Chirality, left and right-handed. Do you know all the chemicals in all the amino acids are optically active? They have two forms except glycine. So all the other 21 are like this with two forms. And all the amino acids in a protein are left-handed. It'd be rather like if this room were full of gloves. I mean, millions of gloves in this room. And somebody who's blindfolded goes along and picks out one left-handed, another left-handed, another, an equal amount of left and right. What are the odds against this happening? And by the way, all the sugars in DNA, ribose, deoxyribonucleic acid, they're all right-handed. There's a handout on that. And there's no handout on that. DNA, amazing chemical. Read the handout. I'll get through quickly. A nucleotide, base sugar phosphate, you'll know that from your if you're doing biochemistry. DNA, design, not accident. There's a thing about it. What's wrong with it? You need a designer in the beginning. In the beginning. Does that ring a bell? Heat, yeah, you can't have that. Hydrothermal vents, gives out water, yeah. Phosphate ions react with calcium ions. There's a lot of calcium in the body, bones, teeth, etc. Side reactions, you can't stop at the stages the OOL people say you can stop at. They'll carry on and degrade. Chirality. So which came first? Yeah, Richard Dawkins. I asked Richard Dawkins once. I said, I've got an answer to the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? He said, oh. And I said, God created chickens. And he said, that's absurd, he said. He got quite shirty. It's on the, I don't know, it's on, Channel 4 edited my YouTube clip of me and Dawkins. He edited out all the good bits. At the end, he asked me how I became a Christian. He couldn't believe that anybody with my background, he thinks all creationists are brainwashed from birth. And they've learned it in church, they're brainwashed in school. He calls it brainwashing. I said, I came to faith in Jesus Christ, age 34 years old, with a degree in chemistry. I'd been a teacher in a good school, I was enjoying it, and then God just got hold of me. And I gave my life to Christ. And then God started to dismantle all I ever believed about science. It took about 5 years, because I started off by saying, well, I know Jesus is alive, but he must have used evolution. Well, I don't believe he did. So, information. The second half of that slide is all about information. It doesn't happen spontaneously. Some facts about E. coli. I do a lot of genetic research on E. coli. Again, it's just facts about the complexity of what's called a simple cell. E. coli is a prokaryote. There's no nucleus. There's DNA with no nucleus. Not a eukaryotic cell like we're made of. Oh, right. Has anybody come across this fellow's work on the Professor James Tour, T-O-U-R? Well, he's good, isn't he? Take a tour. He's at Rice University. He's written about 600 papers. He's a very clever guy. He's a believer. I think he's got a Jewish background, and he's again, James Tour. If you're just jotting anything down, do a search on him. Some of his stuff is absolutely lethal to evolution. Let me just quickly go on what he says. Tour points out the defective science underlying origin of life research. Lack of analogy to a primordial ocean. Yeah. So amino acid monomers do not spontaneously assemble to form proteins. You need enzymes to do it, but enzymes are themselves proteins. So again, you're in a chicken and egg situation. Even with the correct amino acid sequence, a protein isn't just a collection of amino acids. That's called a primary structure. It has to be folded up in a very clever way to allow it to act think of a lock and a key. The molecule it's reacting, the substrate, it's got to fit into the space by the way the atoms are coiled. The molecule itself, sorry, the molecule as a whole is coiled. You need high concentrations. You can't get that in the primordial soup. It would be too dilute. Since there's a pure enantiomer, enantiomer is one of those left or right-handed forms. The mirror image isomers, they're called enantiomers. Reactions won't stop where you want them to. Yields are approaching 100%. You haven't got enough. You have to start again and make some more. How do you do that? Called the mass transfer problem. Organisms care about life. Chemicals don't. Yeah, again, you can read that if you ask for the thing. I'll give it to you. So here's, it says, this is what an origin of life researcher wants to do. They buy in from suppliers pure chemicals and then mix them in high concentrations artificially under controlled conditions in a modern laboratory. Again, research interference by the researcher. Then get a mixture of compounds which they say resemble either protein, nucleic acid, carbohydrate or lipid. Publish a paper, bold claims, the press are gullible, life in a test tube, and then encourage science textbook writers to say it's all happened by chance, because there is no, it's godless. And it's not science, it's corrupt, it's anti-science. I'm coming soon. One final quote: spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. When it comes to the origin of life, there are two, it's an old quote this, it's 1950s. Two possibilities, creation or spontaneous generation. That was disproved 100 years ago, so therefore supernatural creation, but we don't accept supernatural creation on philosophical grounds, not scientific grounds. That means I believe there is no God, therefore there's no designer. So I clutch at any straw I can to try and duck out of accountability to a personal God who will be our judge one day. We believe the impossible. Life arose spontaneously by chance. It's crazy. Oh, there's my Fred Hoyle quote, which Nigel said earlier. It's enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. Fred Hoyle was no Christian. He may well have died, sadly, without God. But he was closer when he said, I don't believe in this, Big Bang. He had this theory of the universe. And my final person I want to talk about is Krauss. This is the guy who wrote, I think he is another God hater. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing. Well, that's great, isn't it? First there was nothing, and then it exploded. I mean, it's nonsense. And this is a horrid quote. He says, why are we here? All the elements that form your body, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, all things that matter for evolution, weren't created at the beginning of time. And watch this one. Forget Jesus. The stars died. Not Jesus died on a cross. The stars exploded and all the elements formed, so you could be here today. We're all stardust, he says. One day, I hope he repents and turns to Christ. Oh, that's my final slide, actually. I didn't want to show that. Is that right? Only hydrogen, helium and lithium at the beginning of creation? Everything else formed from, you'll hear this. This is called, what do they call it? Nucleosynthetic theory. The formation of the elements. Well, Genesis, the first chemical compound in the Bible is water. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That means there was hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. Genesis 2:11 mentions gold. Genesis 4 mentions bronze, which is alloy of copper and tin. Mentions iron. Genesis 13 silver. Genesis 9. It's all in Genesis. Have you noticed the book of Genesis is foundational? Brimstone is sulfur. I really hate spelling sulfur with an F. Anybody here thinks sulfur should be spelled with a PH? Yes. We don't want to do what the Americans do we? I think you should spell, sulfuric acid, copper sulfate. Sorry, if you're American here, I apologise. Yeah, we're finished now.